Okay, let's continue where we left off. Now, we were talking about the fact, just to sort of bring us back to where we left off last week, we're talking about the fact that a very important aspect of prophecy is, and something you see a lot in Amos, is that it is universal, right? God is the God of all nations and not just, like typical local gods, right? And you remember the story of Jonah, right? Jonah, one of the key lessons that Jonah found out is you can't run away from God, because God is everywhere. And that was, for him, it was a lesson in how God has something to say to every nation, that even to the enemies of Israel. Read Nineveh, right? So I want to go back to Amos chapter 9. This is from verse 2, right? God says through Amos, if they burrow down to Sheol, to the underworld, from there my hand shall take them. And if they ascend to heaven, from there I will bring them down. If they hide on the top of Mount Carmel, right? There I will search them out and seize them. And if they conceal themselves from my sight at the bottom of the sea, there I will command the serpent to bite them. And if they go into captivity before their enemies, there I will command the sword to slay them. In other words, God is God everywhere, all right? Now, putting God in charge of everything, making God the cause of everything is a big problem in Jewish thought. And I'm not going to discuss that a whole lot here today. I just want to acknowledge that it is a problem, right? When I go to pay a Shiva call on someone, or when I see someone in the hospital, I don't say, well, God is in charge of everything. Mm-hmm. Therefore, there is a reason why you're here. And God must have done this to you. No, that's bad theology, and it's really bad pastoring too. So the point of the prophet is the God of Israel is the one God for the entire world. Right. But watch out for those other pitfalls, because we don't need them. All right. Now, another question that people ask about in reading here is, were the Jewish kingdoms as bad as the other nations? Right? Or you would think probably not. Right? Heschel also says that if things were as bad as the prophets say, you would have found it in the book of Kings too, which is a more historical viewpoint of those times. Right? But to say that the Jews are no worse than anybody else really misses the point. It certainly misses the point that the prophets are making. What if God has a plan for you and you're not living up to it? Okay? And this is, God has a plan for the Jewish people, but you're not living up to it, right? So there is a problem, and it's certainly true that there are not that many places where the poor and the powerless get the respect that they should have as human beings. There are not that many places where they get a fair hearing, right? So none of the nations are perfect in that regard. Some are better than others, right? But you, the Jews, you're supposed to set a standard, right? This kind of reminds me of a story that was told about Yitzhak Rabin. Somebody once asked him when he was prime minister about how unfair it was that Israel was being held to a different standard from the other nations, a higher standard. He said, I'd be insulted if we weren't held to a higher standard. That's what we aspire to, right? Now, sometimes it's unfair, sure, but, and sometimes you can tell when people are picking on the state of Israel in ways that they don't pick on much more tyrannical regimes, right? And you can say, well, that's not kosher. But that we have a higher standard, I think the prophets take that for granted. And that's why mostly they prophesied to the Jewish people and to the Jewish nation. Okay? Heschel also says the prophets are not comfortable with a middle-of-the-road approach. And what you have to do as a Jewish nation, you strive for the summit, and that way you avoid the abyss. Right? Now, the problem with that is that sometimes you don't even get incremental change, and you're not glad for getting incremental change, right? In this country, it's hard to get anything done. So, incremental change would be a big blessing, right? But Amos is not looking for incremental change, right? Amos is like a muckraker. Right? What's a muckraker?
Somebody digs up dirt.
Stirs the pot. Yeah, what else?
Someone that digs up dirt on people.
Who he's bringing up muck. He's bringing up dirt on other people. Right? Now, as far as we know, Amos is not successful. He doesn't bring about any change among the people he prophesied to. Right? They just kept doing what they were doing before. Of course, maybe they reaped the consequences of that too. That's why they're not around anymore. Maybe. Yeah, Jared, you were going to say something?
Okay, so anyway, this whole subject of, we talked about that yesterday in class about when they were given the Torah at Mount Sinai. It went around to all the other nations, right?
Yes.
The other nations found something they didn't like and said, nope, not for me.
Right.
And maybe that's possibly a reason why they don't like the Jews, because the Jews accepted things
They didn't want to accept. That is really my explanation for the existence of anti-Semitism, right?
Say that again? Say that again.
I'm going to explain it to you, okay? I'm going to try and say it in a different way than what Jerry did. But I believe that a major reason for the existence of anti-Semitism, and maybe the reason for it, is the following. It is common belief among non-Jews that the Jewish people brought the moral law of God into the world. I'm not saying it's so. I'm saying this is what is commonly believed. Now, some people are really grateful for that. I had a pastor in a church where I went to speak tell me, we want to thank the Jewish people for preserving the Bible, for preserving the Word, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Not everybody is so grateful for having the moral law. There are people who, by their nature, reject the moral law of God. Now, if you have a complaint with God, how are you going to file that? It's really hard to get back at God. God gives you laws that you don't like. What are you going to do about it? The answer is you shoot the messenger.
You what? Shoot the messenger.
Yeah, but didn't it rise more when
No, you can't complain.
church
You shoot the
was
messenger.
accepted with, for Jesus?
Well,
and
right,
that?
because
And
even in the
because we-
church, there are people who don't like the moral law. And the church actually gave them a space for that by allowing them to put faith over works to the extension of works, right? All you had to do was have the right belief, and that was easy. And, so you get the Spanish Inquisition.
Because we didn't accept that belief, that they were discriminated against us, that it was wrong or something like that.
Yeah. And, we're surprised when this happens, right? As the famous Monty Python line, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, right? We're somehow surprised at anti-Semitism, even though it's been around, for as long as Jews have been around, right? Well, but here's the thing, it didn't really exist until Judaism as a religion became well enough known for people to believe that Judaism brought the moral law of God into the world. But some people are not fond of the moral law. I mean, some of them may be your neighbors. Some of them may be Jews for that matter, right? But that's the problem.
I thought it was like not accepting Jesus Christ.
But that doesn't explain why there are anti-Semites in the Muslim world.
Well, there is some writing attributed to Muhammad that says Jews are the enemy of Islam. And some other things in the Hadith that
Oh, sure.
are a little
Sure.
controversial that happened after
Yes.
his lifetime.
And it's a mixed record. I mean,
It is
in
a mixed
Christianity too, okay? But there is anti-Semitism that is religious in nature. There's anti-Semitism that is secular in
Yeah.
nature, right?
That's what they're taught.
It's just, what people are taught. Yeah, you had to.
Basically, when they created the Quran, the Jews were the ones who were teaching the first people who wrote the Quran. The Jews were the ones who were trying to teach them what it's all about this.
But anti-Semitism is ignorance, whether it's of Christianity or Judaism. The people
Well,
who are
I'm not
anti-Semite-
sure that it's always ignorance, all right? There are some very intelligent and learned anti-Semites. It's true.
Maybe their opinion,
It's true.
they're very.
No, I mean, there are people with academic degrees, right? And people, in political high places who are out and out anti-Semites.
Yeah, Pol Pot had an education.
But that doesn't mean that they're intelligent if they get too political.
No, well, that's true, okay, but, fine, yeah, point taken, but still, right? Intelligence is not necessarily a sign of morality,
Amen.
No, no.
right? There are some very bright, immoral people in the world, and many of them are anti-Semites.
Don't you think a lot of that is door la door, that it comes down from the house where their parents were anti-Semites too?
Well, yeah, very possibly. I'm not sure that it's always the case. Sometimes, a person has their own deficiency and they find a target
Right.
for that. And the Jews are always a very convenient target because part of their problem is the inability to live with morality. And therefore, let's blame the people who brought morality. If I can kill the people who brought that standard into the world, then, that puts me above the moral law. Now, this is,
Very
I would call the psychological explanation of anti-Semitism. It explains why there is anti-Semitism even in places where Jews don't live. Right? The most frequent answer about anti-Semitism, it's the scapegoat theory. Right? The scapegoat theory, right? The Jews are the scapegoat for all the sins of the world. But I don't buy that. I just, because, it doesn't seem to depend on what the Jews do or how high their status is. It seems to be independent.
That's true,
Yeah.
Rabbi, because even if we're in a culture, we have someone like the Rambam that's a position for the Sultan and all this kind of stuff, I'm sure it still existed. Even though he's in this incredibly exalted position.
Yeah.
Well, when you look back historically, where is the greatest amount of anti-Semitism? Is it in the Muslim, I'm not talking now. Is it in the Muslim world like 500 years ago?
Marcia, I have a very thick book in my library at home. It is called A History of Muslim Anti-Semitism.
Going back that far.
Well, it goes back to the beginning of Islam,
700, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that all of Islam is necessarily anti-Semitic. It means that there is plenty of it. It's a thick book. It's good documentation, right? About Christianity, I don't have to tell you, right?
Encyclopedia.
About, and again, it's not that any religion is necessarily anti-Semitic.
But I think that in Catholicism, until very recently, they would always pray for the perfidious Jew every Sunday morning.
Until the
The
80s, right?
perfidious Jews, right?
Perfidious.
So, from the get-go,
Right,
they are inherently wrong, right?
right,
Yeah, so, a lot has changed in the Christian church.
right.
The human soul still has some work to do.
You know, I never believed that went on in the Catholic Church, and I had a friend who invited me to a church service in
Yeah.
London, and I went, and man, right in the middle of that service, and now let us all pray for the
Yes,
perfidious Jew.
yes. Now, that is no longer part of the Catholic
Right.
liturgy,
I know it's no,
right?
they
And
changed.
by the way, Heschel was very involved in the discussions with the Pope and Catholic leadership at the time of the writing of Nostra Aetate in the 60s, right? And he was significantly responsible for certain parts of that statement by the church, which led to the elimination of any desire to convert the Jews, to have a specific conversion to Jews. Doesn't mean they wouldn't convert,
Right,
but there are still many evangelical churches like the Assemblies of God and the Southern Baptists who have specific ministries to convert the Jews, right? But that's no longer true in the Catholic Church. And Heschel was very involved with that.
Amazing person.
In a lot of ways. I mean, I'm trying to bring in little dribs and drabs
Yeah.
about Heschel's
Yeah.
life and his various areas of work, because that's, hopefully that will lead you to read a little further in Heschel down the road. Or we'll have a course just on Heschel's teachings.
Was
Yeah.
Nostra Aetate in the 60s? I
Yeah.
thought it was in the 80s.
yes. It was
Whatever the statement was that was in the 60s
Oh,
Yeah.
was the big
okay.
change.
Oh,
There
okay.
were other changes later.
Right.
It was 60.
Yeah, Robin.
In talking to people that are not necessarily anti-Semitic, but are not Jewish, I find a prevailing theme that dates back to when the Jews were the moneylenders. And they say it continues today that the Jews control the financial institutions, and by controlling the financial institutions, they basically control the world's economy, they
Yeah.
control the world.
So again, none of this is factual, right?
This is what they believe.
But it is what people choose to believe
Yes,
because it's convenient.
it's
But
convenient.
it doesn't explain the psychology of it. Why people would believe such a thing when it's so demonstrably untrue.
Because we're so successful at what we do. Even in Germany,
Oh, yeah.
30% of the
Yeah.
lawyers
I'm so rich.
pre-Nazi.
Yeah, me too.
We are all.
Right, we're all just
We're all-
rolling
But
No,
the
in
dough.
general.
I just want to sum it up in a couple of words.
No, I don't want you to.
That's
I'll
all
tell you
good.
why.
Okay.
Because this is really an aside.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
I don't want to keep going on about
All right, okay,
anti-Semitism
sorry,
because
all right.
that was, I occasionally I will work that in. But I want to go back to the prophets, and I want to go back to what Heschel says about the role of history in the prophets, right? So If you have the one volume version, this is page 190. It may be different in some versions, right? And he says, history is not a meaningless conglomeration of neutral facts, but a drama unfolding the relationship between God and man. The drama is staged in time and encompasses the wide arena of human affairs. A battle is raging. The prophet comes in because the prophet sees the battle raging. Man in his presumption undertakes to fashion history in disregard and defiance of God. The prophets witness the misery that man endures as well as man's wickedness that God endures and even tolerates. But God is wrestling with man. History is where God is defied, where his judgment is enacted, and where his kingship is to be established. For it is of the realm of space, not the realm of history, that the angels proclaim it is full of his glory. Only a sprinkling of his glory is found in history. Okay? So, we have these high standards that the Bible establishes for us, that God establishes for us, right? Hence, the moral law, right? It's only human beings who in history don't want to live by the moral law. And that includes sometimes Jews as well.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so a person, according to Amos, a person who wants to serve God has to care about what's going on in this world, has to care about schools and marketplaces and law courts and prisons and social service agencies and orphanages and everything else, right? You don't serve a just and merciful God unless you are just and merciful. That's a tough challenge, right? That's the problem. Now we come to Hosea, right? We know that Hosea delivered his messages in the late 8th century before the Common Era. And he was also in the Northern Kingdom, and he actually also lived in the Northern Kingdom, okay? This is the time, the 8th century before the Common Era, right? That's 722 before the Common Era, when the Assyrians conquer the Northern Kingdom. It's a time of major instability, which probably contributed to the defeat of the Israelites, because 4 Israelite kings were assassinated over a period of 14 years, right? You think of all the instability in Haiti, just, the last few months after, one president was assassinated, on top of all the other stuff they've got going on there, right? Imagine 4 such assassinations in 14 years, okay? So that probably also contributed to the downfall of the kingdom. But Hosea isn't talking about that. Hosea is concerned with a different theme. And injustice is not his biggest concern, though he may have had something to say about that. His theme is idolatry. Well, there is this thing called the 10 Commandments, right? And the 2nd commandment says, you shall have no other gods before me, right? And there is no depicting God in material form. Now, it doesn't say in the 10 Commandments why that is a sin. It just is, right? Hosea tells us. Why is idolatry a sin? Anybody want to take a guess? Why is idolatry a sin?
Well, because it gives form to something that is formless.
Okay, that's true, but that's not it. So you get part credit, right? Yeah. Why is idolatry so terrible?
Rejects God the Creator.
You're on the right track. But Hosea puts it more forcefully than that. He says idolatry is adultery.
What?
Adultery. Yeah,
The
Adultery.
equivalent of adultery.
it is adultery. It is adultery. And it's not only adultery, it's prostitution. He says Israel leaves God, who is her spouse, for lovers who pay for sexual favors and offer more money than her spouse provides. And let me give you text for that from the 2nd chapter of Hosea, verse 6 and 7, right? I will also disown her children, for they are now a harlot's brood, in that their mother has played the harlot. She that conceived them has acted shamelessly, because she thought, I will go after my lovers, who supply my bread and my water, my wool and my linen, my oil and my drink. Okay, I mean, that's fairly direct, right? Yeah. Idolatry is adultery and prostitution.
Nowadays, idol is the same these days. Money is idolatry. Following your passion for money, only for money, it's like some kind of idolatry. And we all doing that. What about
In a
only?
sense, I mean, I can give that sermon if you want about how, certain things become false gods.
Yes.
If you don't manage your desires,
Right.
they become gods unto you.
Right.
Okay? I'm not going to give that sermon today. I'm just going to help you read Hosea's sermon. Yeah, Jerry.
Okay, so remember, we had this whole stuff about Balaam the prophet. He couldn't curse the Jews, and he went on and on and on, and he said, well, I'm not gonna curse the Jews because God won't let me. But let me tell you about the Jewish weakness, which was the idolatry, the Moabites, that whole business.
Yes.
And I think this is what you're talking about.
Well, it's a very specific thing to the northern kingdom that Hosea prophesied to, right? When a couple gets married, the presumption is that they are promising fidelity to one another, right? And at Sinai, Israel promised to be faithful to God. And now there's this temptation, as you said, right? To go after pagan gods, right?
Well,
But this is, God took them out of slavery. God gave them sustenance in the desert, led them to the land of Israel. And what does he get in return? They get into bed with foreign gods and they exchange sexual favors for cheap thrills. Right? Now, it sounds a little trite almost, but really that's what Hosea has to say. Now, what exactly did they do? Some scholars say probably wasn't all that bad. Was mainly practicing superstitions, believing in demons, using amulets and spells. I don't think that's what got Hosea so worked up. Right? In the neighborhood, there were prominent foreign gods like Baal and Astarte. Right? And those gods have a certain advantage in that they give people something tangible to focus on. But an idol is a thing. It may represent something more, but it's a thing in a way that God cannot be thinged. Right? So, we don't have enough to go on to be sure, and they certainly didn't write about all this stuff. All we know is how Hosea responded. And the key thing about Hosea, and this is even more dramatic than idolatry is adultery, right? He didn't just say this to the Israelites, he lived it. I'm going to explain that to you. God doesn't say to Hosea, go tell it to the Israelites. He says, I want you to live with an adulterous woman, with a woman who's going to be false to you, right? So here's the beginning of Hosea, and this is what, God tells him, see, go get yourself a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom, for the land will stray from following the Lord. So he went and married Gomer, the daughter of Divine, right? Why Hosea actually does this. I mean, if God told me to do this, I would say, you out of your damn mind. You want me to do what?
Let me ask my wife.
This is not funny. She conceived and bore him a son, and the Lord instructed him, name him Yisrael. It's like the valley of Israel, Jezreel, right? For, Jezreel means God will sow. In other words, God's going to bring consequences on this field here, right? For I will soon punish the house of Yehu, who was king at that time, for the bloody deeds at Israel, and put an end to the monarchy of the house of Israel, right? Some texts, by the way, don't have the bloody deeds at Israel as, the Baal days of Israel, right? So, and in that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. She conceived again and bore a daughter. And he said to him, God said to him, name her Lo Ruhamah. Lo Ruhamah means no mercy. What kind of name is that for you? Right? Call her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer accept the house of Israel or pardon them, but I will accept the house of Judah. Right? And then, after weaning Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son, and God said, name him Lo Ami, not my people. For you are not my people, and I will not be your God.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. So, Hosea is supposed to know in his life how God feels about being betrayed, because he will be betrayed, right? Now, Maimonides looks at this episode in Hosea's life and the whole story of his wife and children and says the whole thing was a dream. I'm glad you feel better. I don't think so. So, it's not clear if she was a prostitute before or whether she becomes one afterwards. Either way, and she bears him these 3 illegitimate children that are not his children.
I thought they were his children.
No, they are,
Page 66.
she becomes or reverts to becoming a prostitute
Excuse me.
and has these children with other men.
So she's a wife, but she's really not a wife.
Did they do a DNA?
She is an adulteress,
Those were not his
right?
children.
Now, by the way, in ancient Israel, what was the punishment for adultery?
Stoning.
Stoning, right.
Tony,
Right, so theoretically, Hosea could have mustered the power of the law against her and had her killed, right?
but I think Hosea was trying to protect her.
Well, how does Hosea actually feel about her? There's anger, but there's also love, right?
He knew that she was
So
an
here's-
adulterer.
Here's what it says in the 2nd chapter of Hosea. It says, this is him speaking the words of God to people. Rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. And let her put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. Else will I strip her naked and leave her as on the day she was born, and I will make her like a wilderness. Render her like desert land and let her die of thirst. That's what's going to happen to you guys for being idolaters / adulterers. Now, is it Hosea speaking, or is it really God speaking to the people? At least Hosea not only says it, but he has internalized the message. Right? And by the way, that little passage, has the references to the desert and the wilderness, sort of suggests that if Israel doesn't change its ways, it will become like a desert. Right? The land will become a desert. So, yeah,
There's no loyalty,
Hosea,
no knowledge of God.
his life is meant to mirror God's life with Israel. In other words, his agony is a depiction of God's agony over the relationship with Israel.
Do the people see that? Or the people are supposed to see that?
The people are
No, they
supposed
came
to
on
see
Wednesday
it.
and
We don't know whether any of them actually do.
Sure, yeah.
Because, what happens to the prophet, right?
No.
Does anybody listen to the prophet? Afraid not. Not usually. Some people may have heard. Some people may have left and gone south. We do know that there are some survivors after the destruction of the kingdom that went south and sort of got absorbed into the southern kingdom with the rest of the Jews. That was it. Okay. Another little passage from chapter 2. She did not consider this. It was I who bestowed on her the new grain and wine and oil. I who lavished silver on her and gold, which they use for Baal. Assuredly, I will take back my new grain in its time, and my new wine in its season, and I will snatch away my wool and my linen that served to cover her nakedness. Now will I uncover her shame in the very sight of her lovers, and none shall save her from me. That's God talking to the Israelites, right? And if you want a more extreme passage of that, let me give you one from chapter 13. Right? So I am become like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I lurk on the way. Like a bear robbed of her young, I attack them and rip open the casing of their hearts. I will devour them there like a lion. The beasts of the field shall mangle them. Come on, God, tell us how you really feel. Yeah, Sherry, you had a question or comment.
Okay.
Will be like a lion.
Going back to I talk about Bill and the prophet. He, supposedly he was the biggest prophet of the non-Jews because he talked to God. And God wouldn't allow him to do anything. And somehow or another, he introduced this concept of going to the Moabites.
And going to worship false gods.
Yeah.
The fertility cults and what have you.
But the thing was,
And see, this is the great thing about fertility cults, right? They're fun.
yeah. But the things they did,
That's
It
from
said-
not from direct knowledge, is it?
they introduced the concept from Bill, and I guess God said it was okay. This is the Jews' weakness right here.
Yeah,
This
but,
is never gonna go
well, it's a
away.
human weakness. I don't think it's just a Jewish
Yeah,
weakness.
what I'm saying,
Girls just want to have fun, and the boys too, for sure, right? So fertility cults were fun.
Right.
And, you didn't have to think too much because it was sacred, right? It was legitimized. And so everybody said, okay, sounds good to me. Okay. So Hosea is, yeah, Karen?
So
what the prophets are writing, is that supposed to be literally God's words, or is this kind of their interpretation of what they're hearing God say?
Well, you tell me. I'm looking at this passage in Hosea, okay? I think that's not something the prophet makes up, that, the lions are gonna rip you apart.
But it's so interesting, though, the parallel with his life, because in some ways it seems like he's displacing his anger at the people he's going through this at home with this woman and then he's expressing basically the same thing. I mean, it's interesting to wonder kind of which came first and who's really saying it. And
The point is, he is meant to live out in his life what God is feeling, right, in his relationship with his spouse, people of Israel. Right? And maybe he feels the same way, that, there are times when he would like to have his wife ripped apart by wild animals, right? But there are also passages where God says, I can't bear to do that. I still love my people. I still have hope for my people. And, you marry someone that you love, unless you're Sam Kinison, all of a shalom. Remember the comedian Sam Kinison?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So he would get up and talk about women, all right, in a way that probably wouldn't fly today. But in 1990, I think that's when he died. In the 1980s, it was okay, and it was really funny, by the way. He would just scream out about all the promises that his wife made, and then put him through hell and so on and so forth. In reality, he was a very happily married guy and so forth, but that was his shtick, right? And yet, he sort of understood that this was part of the human condition, that, you could be betrayed by someone and still love them. And Hosea still has feelings for his wife, just as God has feelings for the people of Israel, even though they have betrayed him, right? Does God still love Israel? Does Hosea still love Gomer? Well, disillusioned love can express itself like Sam Kinison, right? With that, that outcry, that scream, kind of the primal scream, right? If you ever want to waste 10 minutes, go find a YouTube with Sam Kinison, right? Kinison. Yeah. He actually comes from a highly Pentecostal background, which may explain where he developed the scream. He was not Pentecostal, but he was a normal person who wound up unfortunately dying in a car wreck prematurely. Very funny guy, if you go for that sort of thing. So disillusioned love can express itself as anger, but it may also still be love, right? It's emotional, so it's not necessarily always consistent, right? Another passage here from the end of chapter 2. Okay? I'm going to punish her, but it says, assuredly, I will speak coaxingly to her and lead her through the wilderness and speak to her tenderly. I will give her her vineyards from there in the valley of Ahor as a plowland of hope. There she shall respond as in the days of her youth, when she came up from the land of Egypt. Okay, I want to share with you something that may gets you to look more at this whole portrait of Hosea and his wife, as well as God and Israel. And that is, there was a fictional treatment of this in an unfinished novel by a guy named Milton Steinberg. Milton Steinberg was a very prominent conservative rabbi who died in 1950. Okay? He wrote a novel, which is one of the great Jewish novels of the 20th century, and it's called As a Driven Leaf. Any of you familiar with it?
I've heard you mention it.
Yeah, Lou, you know. Okay.
Say
So,
your name.
As a Driven Leaf,
What's the author's name?
Milton Steinberg, Steinberg. Steinberg, I don't know how he found time to do all this, because he was a prominent rabbi, a very busy congregation, Park Avenue Synagogue in New York City. Right?
Congregation.
Yeah, a little tiny congregation, right? But Steinberg wrote quite a number of books, and you'd think he had lived a lot longer than he did. He died, he had heart trouble along the way, and he died, I think, in 1950. So, As a Driven Leaf is a novel about the Talmudic character Elisha ben Abuya, who was one of the students of the sages and became a heretic. Okay? The whole story is too complicated to go into, but it's a really wrenching book, beautifully written, very good read. It's an outstanding read.
It's unfinished.
No. As a Driven Leaf was finished.
Oh,
And when he died, there was a manuscript in his drawer, in his desk, of a novel called The Prophet's Wife.
wow.
Okay? He hadn't finished it, and the family didn't know what to do with it. And so it's about, I don't know, 2010, 2012, something like that. And finally, the grandchildren decide, as they're getting, his grandchildren are now my age, right? So they decide to go ahead and have it published as it was, unfinished. So you don't really know what the end of the story is going to be. You can formulate your own guess. I really encourage you to read it, because even as an unfinished novel, it's extraordinary. It's just so good. I'm so glad that
It was published.
that it was published. The Prophet's Wife by Milton Steinberg. Right? And it's just a great treatment of the emotional issues that had to be part of this saga. Now, did it really happen? Well, nobody knows for sure. I mean, but something happened. Hosea was a historical personality. Right? Yeah, is it exactly the way the book portrays it? No, we can't know that. But either way, it's a very, very powerful story. What would Steinberg have written in the end? It makes for a lot of great speculation. And what would God have done? Would Steinberg have given a different ending to the Northern Kingdom? Right? We don't know. Read the book, decide for yourself. Okay? In the actual book of Hosea, who wins out? Well, you have to look at the end of chapter 2. Right? So God says, in that day I will make a covenant for them. In that day when, I comfort the people, the passage I just read before. I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the creeping things of the ground. I will also banish bow, sword, and war from the land. Thus I will let them lie down in safety. And I will espouse you forever. I will espouse you with righteousness and justice and with goodness and mercy. And I will espouse you with faithfulness. Then you shall be devoted to the Lord. And by the way, this last piece, these last two verses, I will espouse you forever with righteousness and justice and so forth, that's part of our liturgy. But you only know that if you put on tefillin, right?
Oh.
Yeah, because when you wind, when you put on the shel yad, there's a blessing. When you put on the headpiece, the shel rosh, there's a blessing for that. And then when you wind it around your finger, like symbolizing a wedding ring, right? The covenant between God and the Jewish people, right? The person putting on the tefillin and doing that winding says, "V'arastich li leolam, v'arastich li b'tzedek u'b'mishpat u'b'chesed u'rachamim, v'arastich li be'emunah yadat et Hashem." Right? That these two verses, I will espouse you forever with righteousness and justice, with goodness and mercy. Right? Those are the terms of the covenant. But it's also in the context of forgiveness, in the context of love. Right? So, at least at this point in the book of Hosea, there is the sense that love triumphs even over betrayal. Comments or questions before we go for today? Please.
Well, basically, love is completely mercy. He's our Father. He loves us. He only wants the best for us, even if with the most evil person. He could be the worst criminal. If he decides that he's going to repent, God picks him up.
Yeah, if only it were so easy.
Yeah.
If only. Yeah, Jerry.
Okay, so the story of the four sages, which you're talking about,
Which I referred to with Elisha ben Abudi.
yeah, well, there were four of them who took the chance to go to heaven or whatever. And Lucia ben Abudi was the one who saw something that made him arrest,
This is the last class.
right?
Or
What about the other three?
Or he just
I know, I signed
misinterpreted
Right.
what he saw.
But the other three had different outcomes.
Yes, I didn't want to get into that story. That's why I didn't tell.
Okay. Well, it's a very
Okay, thank you all very much. Yeah, always a great story.